Morning. Welcome to our second episode of Awesome Adaptations. I'm Alyssa Yapel from ODNR, and I have my awesome coworkers here from our Division of Wildlife. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to them, and they'll give a little wave. I have Meredith Gilbert with me. Meredith will be presenting shortly here, and then I have Jen Dennison, and Jen is going to be helping me with the Q&A. So for those of you who have any questions, please feel free to ask throughout by using the Q&A box. You can ask us questions live here. And then I have Kelly Schott, who is going to be presenting in a little while as well on awesome adaptations for animals found in wetlands. So all life forms exhibit adaptations to the environments in which they live, and each habitat is suitable only to those that are adapted to it. And that's why we broke the series up by different habitats. So last week we talked about grasslands. This week we're talking about wetlands. And the next 2 weeks we'll be talking about forests on June 24th, same time, 10 a.m. And July 1st is river and stream creatures, once again at 10 a.m. So we hope you can join us for those days. And just before we get started today, I wanted to let everyone know that this weekend, June 20th and 21st, is free fishing days in Ohio. So Ohio residents don't need a fishing license to fish over this Father's Day weekend. So it's a great opportunity to get out and fish with Dad or the rest of your family. So hope to see you out there this weekend. And now I'm going to pass it over to Meredith to start with her presentation. So let's see, I'm sending you live now, Meredith.
All right. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Give me just a moment. All right, Alyssa, how does that look? Can you still see just my first slide?
Looks good.
Perfect. All right. So thanks for having us. Just I guess a little bit of an overview of who we are, where we work. Kelly and I are both going to be sort of co-presenting our this PowerPoint here this morning. Kelly and I both work as communication specialists for the Division of Wildlife. So our primary roles include a lot of work with public and bringing educational programs to a wide range of people, whether it's adult public or school groups or kids, a wide range of people that we can reach out to about wildlife education. So I am out of our District 2 office that's in Findlay. So we're broken up into 5 different districts in the state, and I'm Northwest Ohio. So I cover 20 counties in our northwest corner. And then Kelly is out of our Marsh wildlife area office. So if you're not familiar with Magee, Kelly might touch on it a little bit in the presentation as well. But it's a beautiful wetland habitat that is well known for its warbler migration and birding. So if you haven't had a chance to get up there, I definitely encourage you to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into our PowerPoint here. If you have questions along the way, please use that chat button or that chat feature. Happy to stop at any point and answer questions for you. So just a couple of things that we are going to cover. I'm going to set it up, if you were on the webinar last week with Jamie, we've tried to set it up relatively similarly so that we cover a lot of the same information. So we're going to cover what an adaptation is and how we define a habitat. Then we're going to talk about specifically what a wetland habitat is, why we need wetlands for both wildlife and for human purposes, why they're important, and why we care if we have healthy wetlands in Ohio. We want to talk about some of the adaptations that we find in our wildlife that live in wetlands. And then finally, we'll sort of wrap up with how we as Ohioans can protect our wetlands and the wildlife that live there. There we go. All right. So we'll start real basic here. What's an adaptation? Alyssa touched on it just a little bit. Basically, an adaptation is anything, a behavior, a physical adaptation, something, a physical characteristic that allows an animal to survive in its environment. And they can come in a lot of different forms. So they can be different body parts, different body coverings, behaviors. So for instance, just these couple pictures here with the bat, obviously bats are only flying mammal. Being able to fly is a very advantageous adaptation for them because they're able to exploit different food resources by catching prey, the insects and whatnot on the wing that maybe other mammals obviously can't do. So having those wings, that different body part is very, very advantageous for those bats. In addition, things like body coverings. So think about mammals have the fur, it helps keep them warm. Turtles have that nice shell that maybe provides some protection for them. And then, of course, you're going to have behaviors. How are they reacting to certain situations? It's going to be a big one for how they adapt to their environment. The hummingbird there, of course, you can see that it has that long beak, and it's a very long, thin beak that it can insert into flowers to get the nectar out. And you can't see it obviously in this picture, but if you had a close-up of the tongue, it would look like a little bristle brush, and it actually sort of like a bristle brush can grab onto the nectar, and that's how they pull the nectar out of those beautiful plants that they're going to be feeding off of. So again, anything that allows these animals to survive in their environment. So we'll move on to, we know that these animals have adaptations specific to their environment and to their habitat, but what does that exactly mean? What is a habitat? And pause here just for a brief moment to let you sort of think about what you think of when I say habitat and what makes up your habitat where you live. So when I think about my go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say if anybody wanted to answer in the Q&A, they can let us know throughout.
Perfect. Yep. Yeah. So if you have an idea of like maybe what you think about when you think about your habitat around you, yeah, please put it in that Q&A, and we can talk about those as well. But really, a habitat is where any organism lives, whether it's an animal, a plant. Obviously, we have our own habitats where we live, and it provides really everything that an animal needs to survive. So real quickly, think about those 4 major basic needs that you need to survive, and we'll list them here in a moment. So just take a quick beat to think about what it is, just the very, very basic things that you need to survive. So I'm hoping that you guys thought about food, water, shelter, and space. While there are many other things that we obviously hope to have to survive comfortably, especially as humans, these are the 4 basic things that each and every organism needs to be successful and to be able to survive. So we'll talk about a variety of these things today as we sort of go through the wetland habitat and go through some of these adaptations that our wetland creatures have. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Kelly, and she is going to start talking about what a wetland is.
Perfect. Great. Hi there. Yes, I am Kelly, and I do work at McGee Marsh Wildlife Area. This picture that you're actually looking at is of Pickerel Creek, though, which is another wetland near Sandusky Bay. And I thought it was ideal for what I wanted to talk about when we're talking about wetland habitats. So Meredith talked about generally what makes up a habitat, and we're going to talk about what defines a wetland as a wetland. And most people, if I ask them what makes a wetland, most people, the first thing they're going to say is water. So in this picture, you can see on the right, there's water. That's Sandusky Bay. We don't think of Sandusky Bay as a wetland. It is part of Lake Erie. So water by itself doesn't make a wetland. If you look to the left, that's Pickerel Creek, all of that area in there where you can see a little bit of water mixed with land. Those areas are going to have shallow water. That's another thing that's important. So a wetland may have water year-round. It may not have any water at all, depending on the time of year. We'll get into that a little bit later. But then it's also going to have shallow water, so less than 3 feet. And it's going to include both a mixture of land and water. So it's a combination of both. It's not just water. And there's many factors that relate into wetlands. You could do a whole slide presentation on wetland habitat. It's going to include the soils, poor drainage, the plants, the hydrology, even the topography. Wetlands are typically a flat area where you find them. So we could spend a lot of time just talking about wetland habitat, but I just want to make sure you understand the different kinds of wetland habitats there are. And again, it's going to support both land and aquatic animals. So you're going to have things that like white-tailed deer, who what we think of can live in almost any type of habitat. And then you're going to have animals that are going to be very specific to living in a wetland, something like a muskrat. And those are the animals we're going to talk about. The ones that are specific to wetlands, those are what we're going to focus on today when we talk about adaptations. All right, Meredith, you want to go to the next slide? So there's different types of wetlands, and I'm just going to highlight them really quick. The first one, when we talk of a swamp, that's typically a forested or flooded forest is the best way to think about it. It's a place where you have trees and water. Most trees can't survive living in water, so it's a very specific kind of tree that you're going to find living there. In Ohio, you're talking mostly cottonwoods, some swamp white oaks, willows. There's lots of different varieties, but the important part is these trees can't live flooded all of the time. So lots of times in a forested wetland, you're going to may go there and there may not be any water there at all. But that's what we think of when we talk about a swamp. The next two I put together, wet meadows and wet prairies. This is a picture at OSU Marion campus of a wet prairie. And so wet prairies and meadows are areas that will flood, whether it's with rainwater or maybe from flooding from a creek in a rain event. And then the water is going to drain off. But those soils there are really going to hold that water in place. And those are some very water-loving plants that can tolerate that. So lots of times in wet meadows and prairies, you're not going to see a lot of open areas of water. It's going to be solid vegetation. The next one we're going to talk about are vernal pools. Vernal pools are a very specialized type of wetland habitat, and they're found in woods. Typically only in the spring, depending on how wet the fall is. You'll have some vernal pools in the fall as well, but typically we think of them in the spring, and the reason why they're so important in the spring, a vernal pool is a very, very shallow wetland that you'll find in the middle of the woods, and from snowmelt and rainfall over the year, it's going to fill this depression in the woods. Very important for breeding salamanders and lots of other amphibians because there's no fish found in vernal pools that are going to eat the eggs of these creatures. So it's very important for breeding salamanders. The next two, bogs and fens, are really specific types of wetlands, very unique, and actually some of our most rare type of wetlands that we find in Ohio. Typically, they're very similar. Fens are usually a little bit more basic than bogs. Bogs have a little more acidic soil. That's what it refers to, the soil, whether it's a little basic or a little acidic. But again, these are heavily vegetated areas. Usually, it's almost spongy if you can walk on them. But they're very critical habitats in Ohio, and there's not many of them found. This is a picture of the cranberry bog that is out on Buckeye Lake. Really a unique place to visit, and they do have some places where you can actually walk through like this boardwalk on it. The next one is what probably most people think of when they think of a wetland, and that's a marsh. Again, this is up here near Lake Erie, an aerial shot, and a lot of mixture of water and vegetation. Usually these areas are diked in and require a lot of intensive management, which we'll talk about here in a second. So those are the different types of wetlands that you're going to find around Ohio. When you go closer to the ocean, there's different wetlands yet that are salt water or brackish water, and those support a variety of very specialized plants that can handle the salt and brackish water too, but we don't have that in Ohio. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So when it comes to managing Ohio wetlands, management is very important to create a healthy wetland. A non-managed wetland is usually quickly taken over by invasives, or it may not keep the wetland plants there very long. If it's holding too much water, over time those wetland plants will start to die off. So it's very important that we manage some wetlands in Ohio. And they're managed to different degrees. This is a picture of a tractor, and this is at Pipe Creek Wildlife Area. It's just a quick video of the tractor running, and Meredith, if you want to start it, you're going to see the end of the tractor. At the back of the tractor, that's a pump. That's called a chrysopholy pump. You back that down into the wetland, and it actually pumps the water out of the wetland, and it's pumping it into the bay at this point. So at this point, Pipe Creek is relatively dry. Most of the water has been taken out of the wetland. But imagine most of that area was covered with about 1.5 to maybe 2.5 feet of water. And they're pumping it out this year to re-stimulate the growth of plants in the marsh. It's a fantastic time for birds like egrets, herons, eagles. There was even some ducks feeding in there when I was there that day. It was pretty neat. So it really is important that we manage wetlands. Again, we can't manage every wetland across Ohio. Some we manage more intense than others. And if you don't manage a wetland, like if this water was left on in this wetland for very long, it would eventually turn to more of like a pond. All the vegetation would be gone and you'd have just straight water. And that's not really conducive for wetland animals. All right, the next slide, Meredith. So why are wetlands important? Wetlands are extremely important for a lot of reasons. One thing that we think of most often is we refer to them as nature's kidney. So they filter sediments and pollutants out of the environment, out of our water supply. This is going to be used pretty heavily in our H2 Ohio program that Governor DeWine has been promoting. And we're going to see some increased use of wetlands to do this very thing, to try to protect those algal, or try to prevent those algal blooms on Lake Erie. They are really great at filtering sediment and pollutants. They also slow the flow of water, and it prevents erosion. So it's pretty important. Wetlands in strategic locations can really help slow that flow of water to lakes, and it can prevent the erosion along rivers and streams. About 1/3 of all endangered species depend on wetlands for their survival. So that's a pretty huge number when you stop and think about it. Wildlife in general, there's some very specific habitats that you'll find, there's some habitats that very few animals use that's very focused for their survival. And it's not just wetlands. Some animals are focused really on forests or meadows. But when you're talking about wetlands, to have about 1/3 of the endangered species dependent on wetlands, that's huge. They're also great fish spawning areas, and for humans, they provide lots of recreational opportunities. This is a picture of birders up during spring migration at Marsh, and that is a beach, a forested beach ridge that the spring migration, the warblers really pack in there, and as well as the birders, because they're trying to see them. It's really a unique time if you ever wanted to stop up and visit. But wetlands can be used for canoeing, kayaking, fishing, hunting. There's all kinds of opportunities for wetlands when it comes to recreational opportunities for humans. The next slide talks about wetlands in Ohio, and we just wanted to touch really quick. Again, this is something you could spend a lot of time talking about. Just wanted to give you an idea of how few wetlands there really are. So this is just a land use map, and if you notice the very bottom, that sage color is the color of wetlands, and just looking at this map, you can't really even find them, which is kind of scary. because mostly what you're looking at is agricultural land up in the glaciated area and forested land in southeast Ohio and the eastern side of the Ohio. But Ohio has, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we're noted for, we are second only to California in the loss of wetlands since the 1800s. That's huge. We've lost over 90% of our wetlands. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we drained the Great Black Swamp. So that area that just popped up there on your screen in blue, the Great Black Swamp was a flooded swamp, and it was covered in trees. Most of it was covered in trees. Up along Lake Erie, there was open wetlands, but most of it was covered in trees. And in about the mid 1800s, they started draining it. And we were able to drain over 900 acres of that forested swamp. So that really contributed to the wetland loss in Ohio, as well as a lot of other areas in Ohio. We also drained those wetlands as well. The good news is we are turning that around, and it was due to the fact actually up here around the Great Black Swamp, it was duck hunters who were realizing that losing all these wetlands was really impacting our migrating waterfowl populations, and it was duck clubs that started to develop to protect those wetlands. Now we have about 40,000 acres of wetlands that rim Lake Erie, which is fabulous, and that number continues to grow. So restoring wetlands is going to continue on both public and private land around Ohio, which is great for the habitat and the environment. Okay, now we're actually going to start jumping into adaptations, and we're going to start with plants. Lots of times when we talk about adaptations, we think it's only animals that have these adaptations, but plants have lots of adaptations too. And wetland plants in particular have to survive this very wet environment. So these are some examples of plants you're going to find in a wetland, and they're labeled so you can see the willow. Cattail is huge most of the time. You see cattail, you know you're looking at a wetland of some type. The tree here is a cottonwood. Cottonwoods are very shallow rooted, and they can survive living in some standing water. If there's too much water over time, they'll start to die off. This button bush up in the right hand corner, it's a really neat little plant. It's a very woody plant, kind of grows into a little shrub in the marsh, and it has these unique balls that look like buttons, so that's how it's got its name, but it can withstand growing in quite a bit of water too. And in this picture here with the duckweed is actually a floating plant on top of water, and it's the smallest flowering plant that we have in the world. So it's a pretty cool plant as well. When you see duckweed, you know you have a wetland. You want to go to the next slide, Meredith? So how do these wetland plants adapt to this environment? Many times when we talk about plants or we learn about plants, we know that they take in carbon dioxide and they change it through photosynthesis to oxygen. And that's really important for us and for the environment as well. But plants, all plants also need oxygen to survive. And normal plants get this through their roots in little air pockets within the soil that they're living. Wetland plants don't have that that ability to get oxygen through the roots because most of the time they're in water or they're in very wet soil that doesn't have a lot of oxygen. So the cattail, for example, has these channels that are in the stems. And so what this allows for is the leaf actually absorbs some oxygen, and it allows that oxygen to travel down to the roots to feed the roots. Those little channels, those specialized channels, and it's not just cattails, there's other plants that have them as well. They're called Arenchyma. And then other plants like this have these specialized roots. So the roots will grow underwater and then they'll shoot things up above the water. And these are called adventitious roots. Mangroves, which is a saltwater, something you find in saltwater marsh, or bald cypress, those knees that you see pop up in bald cypress, those are great examples of those adventitious roots. Willows do it to a certain degree as well, and same with buttonbush. And then there's some plants that are just very adapted to living in very low oxygen environments. And that's true of the swamp milkweed. You can see the roots are a little different than what you might be used to. They have a very fleshy root, bigger roots than, instead of having all those little spider roots that you sometimes see when you pull up a plant, these have bigger roots, and that's to maximize what little oxygen it might be able to get out of the soil. So those are some ways that plants adapt to living in the wetland world. I'm going to pass it back over to Meredith, and she's going to talk about how animals adapt to living in wetlands.
Alrighty, thank you. So we're going to go through just sort of some of the larger classifications of animals. We're going to start with mammals. So some of these mammals on this slide, you know, they can live in other areas. For instance, on the left-hand side, you see the big brown bat. While not truly specific to wetlands, they can live in other areas. They do prefer areas of, you know, wet areas. So whether it's by the river or by a wetland or pond or something, they like to be around water. But then you start getting into some of these other mammals. So in the upper center part, we have a muskrat. Below the muskrat, we have our beaver. In the upper right-hand corner, you have a mink. And in the lower right-hand corner, you have a river otter. These are animals, while potentially living in some other locations, that are much more specific to wetlands, in particular the muskrat and the beaver. And we'll go ahead and just touch on some of those adaptations that they have that make them so well adapted to wetlands. So for both of these animals, for both the muskrat and the beaver, they are very closely related. They're related, but not as closely as you might think. When you take a look at them, you'd think, oh my gosh, they are almost the same animal. But really, the muskrat is much closely related to things like lemmings and voles than it actually is to the beaver. But they have a lot of the same adaptations, and they use a lot of the same areas, and they do a lot of the same behaviors that allow them to exploit the wetlands. So if you take a look in the lower left-hand picture there, that's a foot. You can see just how webbed that beaver's foot is, and that allows that beaver and the muskrats as well to be extremely good at swimming. So they're extremely efficient in the water. They can move quickly. They have those webbed feet, so they can get through the water very, very easily. They also have, while two very different tails, they have those tails that allow them to use like a rudder. So they are very, very efficient, again, in the water. The beaver also uses that big flat tail to slap the water. If you've ever seen a beaver and maybe it's gotten a little agitated, or maybe it's trying to defend its territory a little bit, they'll slap the water to alert other animals in the area, and sort of as a defense mechanism. So that's another kind of interesting behavioral adaptation with that big tail. They also have that beautiful, sleek fur. A lot of aquatic mammals have oil glands that provide protection to their fur and almost waterproof it. So they're going to have a couple of different layers of fur. They're going to have sort of an internal layer that's going to be closer to the skin that provides a lot of insulation. And then they'll have that outer layer that gets nice and glossy and almost waterproofs them. And this allows them really to stay in the water in our cold temperatures and continue to live in Ohio even throughout the winter. Whoops. Sorry. They also have the rodent teeth. So if you're familiar with rodents, they have extremely large teeth, typically two very large incisors at the front of their mouth, and they use those teeth to cut and to cut through vegetation. So of course, I'm sure you're well aware, beavers like to chew and cut down trees, but they're also ingesting some of that woody vegetation. Same with muskrats, and they use those, what we call ever-growing incisors, to do that. So that means that those incisors are going to continue to grow throughout their lifetime. They're not like our teeth that are just one set size, and if we wear our teeth down, they're not coming back. Rodent teeth actually continue to grow, so they need some of that abrasion. They need to wear those down to be able to continue to eat. With those big teeth are our muskrats and our beavers can build lodges. Many people are aware of beaver lodges. Of course, they're going to be cutting down trees, and they can dam up areas. It's actually one way that we can create waterlogged areas. Beavers sort of create wetlands and pond areas by damming up waterways to make it sort of more of a wetland area where water is retained. But muskrats also build lodges. So their lodges typically are found sort of throughout the middle of wetlands. So if you ever have gone to Miggy or any other wetland, you'll see just sort of this big mound of what looks like debris and cattails. And typically that is a muskrat lodge. And a lot of times, especially in the spring, you may see a goose or maybe even a swan sitting on top. And a lot of times that will be an exposed platform where those birds can nest. All right, so let's move on to the birds. Some of these birds you're probably very familiar with. I have a feeling on the left-hand side you have the blue heron. That's a well-known species in wetlands, but also if you live by basically any waterway, something like a river or a pond, they exploit a lot of different areas. Then you have in the middle bottom there a red-winged blackbird, excuse me, and these are some of this is a male, and so you can see those beautiful red and yellow patch there on the wings. And these birds are some of the earlier migrants that come back to Ohio in the spring, and they build their nests in the cattails and really are very good at exploiting that wetland environment and some of that wetland vegetation. And then, of course, in the lower right-hand corner, you have your bald eagle. Everyone's probably very familiar with the bald eagle. As a side note, we did a citizen science project this spring and asked the public to help us identify every bald eagle nest in Ohio. And we're very, very pleasantly surprised at the number that we got back. We confirmed over 700, about 706 eagle nests in the state of Ohio, many concentrated up around the Lake Erie marshes. So that was a pretty cool project that we were able to accomplish this spring. Two of those birds that you maybe aren't quite as familiar with, in the top middle there is a black-crowned night heron, and then towards the top right is a king rail. And these are two birds that are much more specific to wetlands and really aren't found outside of those areas. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how these birds are using wetlands and why and how they're exploiting this environment. So first and foremost, you'll notice with the king rail and the black-crowned night heron and definitely the egrets and blue herons that we see along the roadways, they have those really long, beautiful legs. And this allows their bodies to stay up out of the water and allows them to get sort of a higher vantage point. They're able to walk through this higher water with those long legs. And they also have, if you see in that photo there of the feet, that's the feet of a blue heron, they have a little bit of webbing in their feet, but really their toes are extremely long. So this gives them a lot of grip. It gives them a lot of stability when they're walking through that sort of mucky, muddy bottom of a wetland. It also is very important. Blue herons and egrets nest in trees. So while they're extremely large, you'd think, oh gosh, they've got to be ground nesting birds, but actually they nest very, very high up in trees in communal areas called rookeries, and those long feet allow them to grab on, similar to what you would think of a songbird, allow them to grab on to the branches of the trees and be able to be stable up in that environment as well. Now, I don't have a photo of it, but if you look over in the right-hand side, that duck is a shoveler duck. And like the beaver, it's going to have fully webbed feet. So this bird, while it obviously is going to be flying around, when it's on the ground or in the water, it's exploiting those waterways and swimming through those waterways to find food. And so having that webbed foot makes it a lot easier for it to move easily through that water. We can also talk about sort of speed and bill shape together, because it has a lot to do with how these birds are finding their food. So for instance, with the blue heron there, you can see it has that beautiful long, almost like chopstick-like beak. And the way that it's going to hunt, it's going to stand very, very still and wait along the waterway. A lot of times you'll see them along the sort of the shoreline, where maybe there's a little fish swimming by, and it's going to stand and it's going to wait and it's going to wait, and then a fish is going to swim by, and it's going to use that sharp beak, lightning fast speed to grab and to go down and grab that fish or whatever other prey, maybe a frog or whatever it might be. So that bill allows it to grab onto that prey, and typically it's going to swallow it whole. And of course, it has lightning fast speed to be able to grab it. If you look down at the eagle, that bird has a different style of beak. This is a predatory bird, where we think of a falcon predatory bird. And so it's also going to have quite a bit of speed, because eagles a lot of times will catch their prey on the wing. So they'll fly over a waterway, use their big sharp talons to just snatch up a fish or whatever it might be from the water, or sometimes from the ground, and then it'll take that prey back to maybe its tree or somewhere on land to eat it. But they don't eat their prey whole. They're going to use that very sharp beak to actually, sort of like a knife and a fork, to tear smaller pieces off and swallow the smaller pieces. The shoveler duck there, you can see it has a very shovel-like its name would imply, a shovel-shaped bill. So it actually is sort of rounded on the end there. And these are, they're not predator birds, they're eating the vegetation. In particular, Kelly mentioned that duckweed that we saw in a previous slide. They eat lots and lots of duckweed and other aquatic vegetation. So what they're doing is they're going to go sort of sift through the water and use their beak like a strainer. So they'll gulp in a bit of water and aquatic vegetation, and then they'll allow the water to strain out on the sides while keeping all of the wonderful vegetation in their beaks that they can then eat. So lots of different adaptations in bill size and hunting techniques, or feeding techniques, I should say, to allow these animals, these birds, to exploit these wetlands. All right, we'll continue on to reptiles and amphibians. Lots of reptiles and amphibians in and around wetland areas. These are just a couple. In the upper left-hand corner there, we have a Blanding's turtle. This turtle is an endangered species here in Ohio and found primarily along the coastline of Lake Erie. Below that, we have a snapping turtle. And in the middle, top middle there, this is a fox snake. This snake is primarily found up in northwest Ohio, just in the counties up along sort of the western basin of Lake Erie. It's not found very many other places, but it is pretty specific to wetlands. Below the fox snake there is a ribbon snake, and I'll talk a little bit more about the ribbon snake here in a moment. And this is a snake that is very much associated with wetlands and really doesn't live too much outside of areas with water. And then, of course, we have in the upper right-hand corner a bullfrog, and in the lower right-hand corner a cricket frog. Being amphibians, of course, their lives are, at least part of their lives, are spent in water, so wetlands are very, very important for them. Oop. There we go. All right, so just a couple of adaptations that we find specifically in some of these reptiles and amphibians. Of course, camouflage for a lot of these animals is going to be really important. For our bullfrog there in the upper right-hand corner, he's sitting in duckweed, and his coloration in that duckweed with sort of the dark water underneath and the light green duckweed on top gives him a perfect camouflage. This is going to help him not only stay safe from other predators, but it could also help him in catching his prey as well. So that's going to be sort of a common theme in a lot of these animals. They're going to try and camouflage themselves in their environment so that they can either stay safe from a predator or catch their prey. The snapping turtle there, like its name would imply, it also uses camouflage, but it typically uses camouflage so it can catch its prey. So it's going to sit very much like a blue heron. It's going to sit and wait and just sort of stay nice and still until a prey item maybe swims by or walks by. And then it's going to use its big jaws, very light, like lightning speed, to grab its prey and eat it from there. So this is definitely one that you want to watch out for a little bit in an area. We encourage people a lot to, if you see a turtle on the road, to move it off the road in the direction that it's going. But if you see a snapping turtle, they have a pretty wide reach. So you want to be extra cautious, maybe just scoot them off the road instead of picking them up to move them off the road. It's my little public service announcement there for that. In the middle, this is your ribbon snake. And like I mentioned before, this snake is extremely well adapted to areas with water. So it hunts primarily in water. It uses a very similar ambush style hunting technique like your snapping turtle would. And it spends most of its time in water hunting. So it's either going to go into the water, can dive down into the water and stay underneath the water for several minutes. It hunts lots of amphibians, fish, minnows, all sorts of different aquatic creatures. And what's really neat is it'll also sit in something like a cattail or another type of sort of long-leafed vegetation, and it'll mimic the movement and the swaying of that particular leaf to make it look and blend in, use that camouflage and make it look like a leaf. So then, of course, its unsuspecting prey comes up and doesn't notice it, and then it uses that very fast speed to be able to catch its prey as well. Just a couple other quick notes for adaptations and primarily amphibians is their ability to, reptiles and amphibians, I guess, their ability to hibernate throughout the winter. So we have a lot of amphibians that, they stick around here all winter, and they use hibernation as a technique to be able to get through those cold weather months. So typically what's going to happen, hibernation is a way for an animal to sort of shut down their system. Their heartbeat slows down, their body temperature really lowers, and it allows them to conserve energy throughout the winter months when there's not really a lot of food to be found in wetlands or other parts in other environments. They even go as far, some amphibians go as far as increasing the level of glucose in their blood, and that basically acts like an antifreeze. So they can really reduce their body temperature to near freezing, but their vital organs won't actually freeze because of that glucose in their blood. So it's obviously extremely effective. And then once the weather starts to warm up, they sort of come out of that hibernation, out of that sleepy state, and then they can start hunting and finding their food again as it becomes available. And then, of course, we just have the amphibian life cycle, like I mentioned before. These animals have a need for wetland or at least water areas. Like Kelly mentioned, vernal pools are extremely important for a lot of our amphibians. That's where they lay their eggs and where their larval states are growing. You can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a tadpole. It's just getting its back two legs, so it'll start losing that tail here relatively soon to become a full-fledged frog. But it's wetlands and waterlogged areas are essential for all of our amphibian life cycles. All right, we're going to wrap up with some invertebrate species. So you're probably well familiar if you've ever visited a wetland or walked down by a pond or a river. I'm sure you've seen some dragonflies or damselflies. So here on the left, we have a common green darner, fairly common dragonfly throughout the state. And then on the far right, we have an eastern pondhawk dragonfly. In the middle there, we have the Baltimore checker spot butterfly. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about that particular species because it is one that is found primarily around wetlands and in areas with water. And that's because of its selection for a host plant. So these butterflies, like many butterflies, they eat nectar, and they can nectar on a wide variety of plants. They don't have to have one specific type of plant that they find the nectar on. The adults can go to plant and exploit and find nectar in a lot of different types of plants. However, like many of our Ohio butterflies, they can only lay their eggs on a particular type of host plant. So for the checkers, oops, I'm sorry, I keep scrolling there. Oh, okay, there we go. So if you're familiar with the monarch, that's a really great example. Monarch butterflies need milkweed plants as their host plants. So the caterpillars, when they hatch out of the egg, they can only eat a milkweed plant. And for our Baltimore checker spot here, they're eating this plant that you see there in the middle of the slide, and this is white turtlehead. And this particular type of plant is found primarily in moist to wet soils, meaning that it's found primarily around wetlands. And in the upper right-hand corner there, you can see the type of caterpillar that comes out of the eggs from the checker spot. And it is, at least in its first couple of instars and its very young stages, it really needs specifically this turtlehead plant to be able to survive. As it grows, it can move to a couple of other different types of plants, but in those early stages, the turtlehead is essential. In the lower right-hand corner, then, you can see that it turns into this amazing looking chrysalis. I've never quite seen a chrysalis that looks like this. And that is very important as well. It's another really great adaptation that this butterfly has. So you can see in every life stage, it has these really bright oranges, bright whites and yellows and blacks. And that is a warning to predators, particularly birds, that might want to come and eat it. And it's saying, don't eat me, I don't taste good, I'll make you sick, I'm not good for you. And so that really bright coloration is just a warning to those predators to stay away. And that's another really fantastic adaptation. We see that in quite a few of our butterflies, in particular things like our monarch and viceroy butterflies as well. All right. And I'll make just one final note about pollinators in general, in the fact that because so many of our pollinators need very specific host plants, habitat loss is having a huge impact on their ability to reproduce and to find enough of these host plants to lay their eggs. So this will be my second service announcement of please plant native flowers in your yards and help out our native butterflies, whether it be monarchs or the checker spots or any of our moths or butterflies or bee species. They really need those native plants to be able to survive. So please consider planting some of those in your yard. All right, just to sort of wrap up here quickly, like Kelly mentioned earlier, we have lost a huge percentage of our wetland habitat in Ohio. And we obviously know that both for humans and for wildlife, wetlands are essential. So these are just a couple of ways that you can help protect and conserve the wetlands that we have and promote establishing new wetlands or restoring wetlands. So in particular, I'll touch on the last one. They're purchasing an Ohio wetland or federal duck stamp. This is money that goes to wetland conservation and to creating new wetlands. So if you are a duck hunter, every duck hunter in Ohio has to buy the Ohio wetland stamp and the federal duck stamp, and excuse me, sorry. And this money goes directly back to wetland conservation. Since its inception in 1934, the federal duck stamp has made about $800 million, raised over about $800 million towards creating wetlands. In particular, it's, I think, created about 5.7 million acres of wetlands. So it's a huge program, and it really provides a lot of money towards wetlands. And even if you're not a duck hunter, if you don't prefer to hunt, that's perfectly fine. We can all benefit from wetlands, and so we can all benefit from supporting programs like the Duck Stamp and purchasing and financially supporting those organizations. So if you have any questions on that or anything, I guess at this point, please feel free to give us a shout in the notes section.
So I'll just say Jen has done too good of a job answering the questions as they've come in.
Perfect.
So, but I do want to ask you, Meredith and Kelly, a couple questions that Jamie was asked last week that I thought were pretty interesting. So I'll start off with, what is your favorite part of your job? Somebody wrote in last week and said that it seems like, you know, Jamie's job was pretty cool, and the same goes for you too. So, yeah, what's your favorite part?
I'll go first, Meredith. That's fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I work at Marsh Wildlife Area, and I've actually had several different jobs within the Division of Wildlife. Actually, I started my career at Marsh shortly after college in the field. So I was a technician in the field, actually managing those wetlands. It was physical and it was laborious. It was really awesome. Got to participate in a lot of things like bald eagle bandings and wood duck nest box checks. They were great. And then I did a lot of other jobs, and now I'm a communications specialist at McGee. And probably my favorite part about being a communications specialist is sometimes I still get to do those really fun survey type things, and I don't have to do the really hard work in the marsh. So that's kind of fun. But the cool thing about McGee is all of those birders that come. We have about 60 to 80,000 birders that come in the spring in about a 6-week time frame. And at first, to be honest, I'm not what I would call a traditional birder, not real like professional birder. So I was a little bit intimidated by that part of my job, and I thought I wouldn't like that part of my job, but I've learned so much from them, and they're such a unique, it's just such a unique part to McGee that I really enjoy talking with them, and I have learned so much. So I really look forward to spring birding season now and communicating with the birders that come.
Yeah, I guess so. Along the same lines as what Kelly said, I love the variety that we have in our jobs. You know, we get to work with our wildlife management and our fish management folks, but we also get to work with our law enforcement officers. And then, of course, we get a huge amount of exposure in working with the public. And that's probably one of my favorite things, is just the sheer variety of things that we're able to do. I love getting out there, in particular with kids. Not that I don't love talking to everyone in the public, but kids are probably my favorite. When you present or give them a presentation or show them something new, they're so engaged because wildlife is so interesting and so eye-opening and really, really cool for all of these kids that it's really neat to just see their eyes light up and for them to learn something new and start sort of appreciating, if they don't already, start appreciating our environment and appreciating what we have here in Ohio. And I love being a part of that.
Hey Meredith, Courtney wrote in and asked what kind of dragonflies were those? So I think that was from your presentation.
Yes, I will go back, and I think I'm still sharing my screen, so let me,
yeah.
Oops, there they were. So on the left there, we have a common green darner, and then on the right is an eastern pond hawk.
Cool. And then let's see. The other two questions, these were kind of fun last week. What is your favorite animal adaptation, or if you want to talk about maybe the weirdest or craziest animal adaptation that you've heard of? That was fun. Jamie said that she doesn't really know what's going on with platypus. She's still trying to figure that one out. So do either of you want to take that question?
So I actually gave this a little bit of thought last week when I heard that question prompted to Jamie, and I guess maybe this is a little bit boring, but I am so fascinated by flight. I'm a big birder. I love birds, but obviously there's so many other things that are flighted as well. But in particular, bird flight and bat flight, I think it's so cool. I think it would be, if I had to choose, you know, something like a superpower that I would be able to have like an animal, I would totally choose flight. And I just think it's fantastic.
Kelly?
So I got my friend here, the ruddy duck. This is actually my favorite bird species. And I'm just fascinated by it because it's a relatively small duck. It's sort of like a little butterball. But they have really powerful back legs. And when they dive down, it's a diving duck. And they can dive really deep down into the water, like 40 to 60 feet. And they can spend a considerable amount of time underwater actually fishing or looking for critters to eat. So I've always been fascinated by the ruddy duck. And a friend of ours was very gracious and had this one mounted for me years and years ago. So that's mine.
Awesome. Well, oops. Well, I think that we're about out of time anyway, so I just want to, I'll take you off the off blast here, Kelly, and just let everybody know that if you want to watch these webinars at a later point in time, I know we had a couple teachers in here today, if you want to use them for your class, they'll be available on our YouTube page. So I shared that link in the Q&A there. So there's also a lot of other cool videos on there. I think Meredith talked about pollinators, and we did a pollinator webinar series, Ohio Protects Pollinators, so feel free to check those out too. And we look forward to joining y'all next week. Tuesdays, a webinar with Ohio Geological Survey on Ice Age fossils, and Wednesdays we will be talking about forest animal adaptations with our folks at the Division of Wildlife. So thanks, everybody.